All right, just make sure everything's working real quick. Okay. Hey everybody, it's been a while since, we were able to record some episodes for the Thursday Talkshow, so I'm excited to get back into it. We have an awesome guest for you today. Our guest today is luckily, very close to me. He's my father. He grew up, a little bit middle class. He's lived in multiple different countries with the military family. He's worked with Microsoft for the past 14 years. He's always been a side hustler. He has multiple side businesses and hustles that he does. And, he's a pretty influential and smart guy. So I figured he would have a lot to share and a lot of benefit to give you guys. Welcome, Bob Mullaney.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. That's a very nice introduction.
Yeah, so you and I had a little bit of a conversation the other day about some of this stuff and a lot of stuff that I never even knew before, like how you really got into, computers and things like that.
Mm.
I wanted to ask you, I know we might have been over this a little bit before, but what was the thing that really got you interested in computers? Because you were, around when they first started coming out and getting popularized.
Old. Yeah, when I first started getting involved with computers, it was on a Commodore 64. Um, so they were kind of just starting to come out, and so my dad bought one for the family, and we had one around the house. And it was fun to play the games, but also at that time, if you had an interest, you could program your own stuff. And so, me and my friends would try to program our own games using like code out of a magazine, and then that turned into us trying to hack different games and give us like level ups and things like that, and customize those games. And that was always fun. And that was kind of my first time working with computers. And then after that, whenever I would go into different jobs, I would try to use the computer to make the jobs easier. And the more and more I did that, the more I felt like, hey, maybe I should give this computer stuff a try.
Yeah, I mean, we've done some similar stuff, at least Ryan and I have when we were younger. I remember we would do that on some Xbox games, which was actually a little bit tougher because code is more developed by now, but
Yeah.
I definitely see what you're saying there. So you were probably pretty young when you started to get into a lot of that stuff.
Yeah.
And this was probably at a time when you were settled in the US, correct?
Yeah. So this would have been in the late 80s, mid to late 80s.
So, how was your experience coming from other countries, living around, especially with the military family, like, and keeping yourself entertained that way, and then coming to the US and kind of, I guess, getting to expand on more of the capitalist front, and then like actually getting to, take part in things like computers and video games and more consumer goods.
Yeah, so I think so when we were traveling, my dad was in the Air Force, and so we would be stationed in different countries 4 years at a time. And so as a kid, moving around always meant a new adventure. So we land in a new place, I get to explore and get to meet new people and see new things. And so that was always very exciting for me. And then when we came to the United States, that was in late grade school for me. And then you kind of get settled in with your neighborhood and your friends, and you see them go off to high school. And so that wasn't something that I had before that. But I did start working very early. I started, my first job was when I was 15. I worked at a Dairy Queen. And I think I just saw like my family and people around me were such hard workers. It seemed natural for me to get started very young.
Yeah, that makes sense for sure. And so you mentioned how you were moving kind of every 4 years, and we've talked a little bit about how your dad was in the Air Force and stuff like that. And we're actually going to kind of shift a little bit more into that with this question. But how did it feel for you when you would, I don't know, like move to a new country, and your dad would have to go off to work? Was it a feeling of nervousness ever? Oh, I'm sure it was because you're in a new environment. But like what sort of feelings, I guess would be the question, came to you when you find yourself in a new environment and your dad might not have been around as much at the time because he was working?
Yeah, so I think it would be considered more old-fashioned these days. My mom was a stay-at-home mom. She definitely managed the household. My dad would be gone for long, long periods of time working. So yeah, I never found it very scary going to new places. I've always felt safe and taken care of. And so as a kid, I didn't worry about the stress of being in a new place. I could make friends very quickly and entertain myself. So I always enjoyed it. I didn't have to move. My mom, one interesting thing about her was that whenever we moved to a new place, the first day we'd get there, she would unbox everything and work all through the night and get the house set up. And by the next day, everything was in its place. So we were never it was never a weird transition. We were all always ready to go because of what my mom would do when we would get there.
That's awesome. I never knew anything like that. That's
Yeah,
cool.
yeah.
Do you know what kind of the motivation behind that was? Why was she so like dead set on getting everything set up day one? Was it because she wanted you guys to feel comfortable in that new environment, or do you think it was just kind of one of those OCD things where she's like, I want to have control over the space that I'm in this new environment?
It's probably both. Definitely, my mom was one who put the family first. And so she'd want to make sure that everything was set up, but also, wanted a clean space. She didn't want things to be, just boxes everywhere. So I think it's a combination of both.
Yeah, that makes sense. And then as your dad sort of started to phase out of the military work when you guys got established in the US, was your mom ever really working any side jobs or anything like that just to help out or just to fulfill her time or anything like that?
She did have some part-time jobs. She worked at a hotel in the laundry for a little while. She also worked at a tennis ball factory. I don't remember a whole lot more that she did outside the house, like a traditional job.
Yeah.
She's always been someone that I consider to be one of the hardest working people I've ever known. So, she wasn't always paid for her hard work, but she definitely would show it all the time.
Yeah, I mean, we've definitely in the past talked a little bit more about your dad than we have about your mom. So your mom is still kind of a mysterious figure to me. And I know there's a lot of depth that goes into that story. Yeah, so I mean, once you guys started to move to the US and get established and settled, like you're talking about late grade school, if I'm remembering that correctly, you went to Arizona first, yeah?
Yep.
And so when you were kind of getting set up there, what was the goal, at least what was the vision for your parents? Why did they settle in that area? And how did you guys feel about that decision?
Well, I mean, I was not privy to the conversations and, what their priorities were. I just know that they, I think they were looking for the heat, somewhere warm and dry. Um, you contrast that with some of the places that we lived before that. We lived in Germany. Actually, it was West Germany at the time. We lived in England, and then my dad spent some time in the east coast of the United States. So I think they were just looking for something warm and dry.
Yeah, makes sense when you're talking about Germany and England.
Yeah.
And so when you first arrived, we talked a little bit about this earlier, but how different was like the culture for you? Because when I look at our infrastructure in the US now compared to a lot of these other countries, especially when it comes to like architecture and real estate. It's insane because it seems like in a lot of other countries, especially in Europe, they use their buildings as like art pieces,
Oh,
which
yeah.
we don't do as much here. Same thing within Japan. Their infrastructure is just insane. So how was it for you coming from those areas and that sort of culture over to the US? How drastically different was that change?
There it was probably a pretty big change, but it was not one that registered with me as being a big change. And I think part of that is because I had this routine of moving every 4 years and exploring and expecting change. And so I guess in that way, change was not unusual for me. It presented an opportunity for me to explore something new. Yeah, the architecture definitely is different. We used to, I mean, we're all pretty familiar in the United States with the yellow school buses. those Blackbird school buses that go down the streets. But in Germany, I remember the school buses that we would take would be these giant blue Mercedes-Benz school buses. And
Nice.
so it just seemed like a really weird luxury vehicle for us to take this to school, but that was kind of their normal school bus.
Yeah, that's interesting. I didn't know that. That I mean, it's definitely a small nuance difference, but it definitely makes sense for sure. I mean, Mercedes is a German company, so
Yeah. And when we lived in these different countries, the other thing though to keep in mind is being on a military base, we were often in apartments, and so we didn't really see a lot of like the neighborhoods and things like that in our day-to-day life. It was just
yeah.
the barracks or the not the barracks, but the base.
Yeah, that makes sense. Would it be fair to say, like, living that sort of life from a very young age that you had to learn to like adapt very early on?
I think so. I mean, I always had a curiosity and enjoyed seeing new things, and so it never stressed me out. And I don't know if that's because I adapted or it was just kind of my personality. So, but it worked well for me.
Yeah. So was this background for you, especially once you started to get older, ever like did you ever find yourself saying, "Oh, it was helpful that I was in this sort of environment or situation, and I'm able to pool experiences and tools and just kind of different cultures to help you figure out different ways and I guess routes through life, whereas somebody who might be stuck in one place might not have as much."
Yeah, I think there's definitely a difference between folks who stay in one place, throughout life. They grow up there and they don't know anything different. Um, my experience is that I welcome going to new places. It's not a real big deal for me. Um, I guess, yeah, I had a different thought, but I've lost it. So,
Real good. So, I mean, you also travel a lot for your job as well. You've been to numerous different countries representing your job. What are some of your favorite places that you've traveled to for that?
well, I haven't been to a ton of places, a lot of places in the United States, so I get to explore around there. But usually, I find myself enjoying, um, warmer climates. Recently, I was in Costa Rica. I was in Uruguay. I do like the Latin American locations as well. Just places to soak up a little sun and a little culture. And yeah, I wouldn't mind checking out more of Europe and Asia as well.
That's awesome. So, what sort of things are you doing when you go down there for work? I'm assuming a lot of it might be networking and conferencing, but what other things are you guys going down there for?
Well, usually it's to connect with the local team. So the company I work for is a massive company with a global presence, and I was responsible for a large region in the United States as well as South America. So it's basically getting in touch with our teams, our partners, and things like that. So outside of that, yeah, you try to find a little bit of free time, but mostly just there to connect with your teams.
And have you ever like gotten any interesting stories from like meeting up with locals or anything like that with your work buddies?
I guess the most interesting things I can talk about, like, I do enjoy going to some of these Latin American locations because I get to practice my Spanish. And that's probably more fun for me than it is for the person on the other side.
Yeah.
Um, and then, like in Costa Rica, we were warned about being careful with our personal goods and not leaving doors open because the monkeys there would come in and try to take things from you. And so, things that you never think about here, you have to, be prepared for. Another thing is I was taking an Uber in Costa Rica with someone who didn't speak English, and we got to the destination, and then I got another one to come back to the hotel, and it started raining, but the person had no windshield wiper on their car, and they were trying to tell me something, and I couldn't understand what they were saying, but they did say one word I understood, peligroso, which is like danger, and basically they were asking, could I drop you off because my car is too dangerous to drive with the rain. And I agreed in Spanish. So I said, sure, no problem.
Yeah, that's that's definitely fair enough.
Yeah.
I mean, that must be very different though, and it kind of gives you a sense of perspective as to kind of how lucky we have it up in our area. Like, I don't remember the last time I had to worry about not having windshield wipers, so it's definitely an attitude and perspective adjustment.
Yeah, I think perspective is a great way to put it. When you go to other places and you see what is normal and common for them, and you get to compare that to your own life, it definitely it gives you some perspective. And if you want to look at all the things you can be grateful for, I mean, it's a great way to compare. And so that's one of the things earlier when you're asking about moving around to different places. You definitely get a lot of perspective, and you value kind of certain things that because you've been to other places and see where it can be really tough.
Yeah, so I know you play soccer now. I've played soccer for most of my whole life. A lot of these countries that you've lived in, soccer is huge, or football as they would call it.
Right.
And so, as a family, we're all pretty into sports, whether that be soccer, football, MMA, things like that.
Yeah.
And so now I was wondering what sort of things like that were your family into, if any? And then did you guys ever really have experiences where like we do now, we can go to Sounders games and stuff like that. Were you guys ever able to get any experiences like that in other countries or even here when you were younger?
Yeah, so I would consider ourselves as like a middle class, maybe even lower middle class family growing up. My parents provided everything for us that we needed. I never felt like we didn't have anything. Um, but we didn't ever go to um, we didn't ever go to like sporting events or anything like that that required um, extra money or any kind of big money. But I did go to the Air Force Base quite a lot with my dad, and we would watch.
Yeah, if I heard you correctly, it said you said that you were able to go to some sporting events, and especially being on the military base, you're able to go and watch a lot of boxing with your dad for Golden Gloves and things like that. So
Yeah.
that's pretty cool. But I also understand that, yeah, especially around those times, like you were saying, modern day concerts and festivals and Coachella and all that was not exactly a thing. And so as you started to get older and progress with technology and kind of evolve with technology, what sort of things started to stand out to you? Like we talked about computers a little bit, but what other things? And then I do have to bring this up and flex you a little bit. Top 3% of Excel users, like that's insane. That's crazy.
Well, I think my background is my dad had us at a very young age. We would practice like logic puzzles, word puzzles, and things like that, and I found those very interesting. Um, and it helped to develop part of my like how I approach solving problems and dealing with ambiguity and things like that. Um, when I started working and trying to figure out like how to use computers to make my job easier, I really just found myself, I would call it just trying to be lazy, right? So if you're doing the same task over and over and over again, it felt like to me that was a great time to utilize technology. And so I would figure out things using Excel or what Lotus or whatever the application of the day would be to try to take care of some of these repetitive tasks because I felt like one, it could save time, the quality was way more consistent, and is probably higher quality and just better use of time. And then so you just kind of, as you start to explore technology, you realize like how much it can help you achieve what you're trying to achieve. And I think just generally tools in general, if you ever find yourself doing the same thing over and over again, it's probably a good chance that there's a tool out there that can help you do it better, faster, cheaper. And that's what I enjoy doing is solving problems.
Yeah, that makes sense. That's awesome. And so you were definitely around the time when everyone's like, oh, the internet's just a fad. The internet's just a fad. What were you kind of saying when people would say that sort of thing?
I didn't think of it as a fad. I really didn't understand how everything was going to become like a mobile form factor. Way back in the day, we would hear like Bill Gates and some other of these technology leaders at the time would talk about, oh yeah, we're going to shrink everything and it's going to go onto to this mobile device. And I didn't really see how that was practical because the early examples of that would be you take your giant desktop and you shrink everything, literally, you shrink it down. And now I can't even see it, I can't interact with it. And it was not a good experience. And then later, when the iPhone came out and Apple figured out, hey, we're not trying to shrink a desktop, we're trying to make a different platform that requires a different UI and different gestures and controls. That really kind of broke it open for me. And so I always felt like technology was going to be important, the internet was going to be here for good. Um, I did not understand how all the companies were going to be valued as high as they were. Like at that time, Amazon was losing a ton of money. This is prior to the dot-com bubble. Um, so just from the finance side, it didn't make sense to me. And of course, later that bubble burst, and then that made sense. And then after that, you kind of had the real businesses stick around, and so it's been really cool to watch that from the beginning.
Yeah, I hear you. But one thought that I have about the subject and the situation is kind of how quickly technology started to evolve, especially around the late 90s, early 2000s up until now. It's just
Yeah.
been such an exponentially fast change and fast-paced game. Do you ever find yourself, taking the sort of technology that we have now for granted and then all of a sudden, like, taking a step back and being like, whoa, I think back to what I was dealing with as a kid when I was programming and trying to hack these games. And now look around, everything is just technology and way more evolved than what it was.
Yeah, I agree with you. Things have definitely accelerated in recent years. I think you have many more people that are aware of it and can utilize it and innovate on it. You've got more tools, you've got training and things like that, and it's common. Um, I actually think that one advantage that old folks like me have is that we didn't ever, like, technology hasn't always been there. And so when the internet goes down, we know how to continue to live. It's not like the end of the world. It's just like going back to the 90s or something like that. And I know that some people, they have such dependencies on it and they're so familiar only with a world with technology and the internet that when it doesn't work properly, um, it's stressful. But also, those same people evolve on technology so much faster. You've seen toddlers just pick up iPads and immediately know how to interact with them. This chat GPT thing,
Yeah.
like, younger people understand it and are getting after it very quickly, while some folks who don't do technology for a living and maybe a little bit older, they're starting to get left behind a little bit.
Yeah. So what do you think the potential for consumers to get over leveraged with these sort of products and endeavors is? Because as you were saying, for these younger generations that rely on technology so heavily, I believe a lot of companies and businesses do as well. Like, especially with our banking system now, we're finally starting to push further and further into technological banking. What kind of problems do you think are posed when you consider getting rid of the physical old school aspect of this sort of technology?
I think one of the things is you, as a consumer, there's so much trust that you are placing in the people that create these tools and technology. They're not perfect. They have problems, and sometimes they actually are not trying to work in your best interest. And so the more you have no idea of what's going on inside the technology, I think the higher the risk is, unless you can guarantee trust and motive and intentions on the other side. So I just feel like um, the more we rely on others, maybe sometimes the less we are understanding about what's going into making that happen. And then it's harder and harder to know, is this going to be a problem for me or not? So I try to stay informed about, like, how does this work, not just what is it doing.
Yeah, are there any sort of things that you may notice behind the scenes as somebody who works in the tech industry, and is around that stuff daily that might give you a little bit of a hint as to where we're sort of going with this sort of technology, or how much faster we're going to start seeing changes?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't thought deeply about it, but I do expect for things to continue to accelerate, similar to the last 20 years, right? So wherever that growth curve was, I think we're going to look back over your past 10, 15 years and say technology was moving slowly, and it's going to accelerate even faster beyond that. So with AI, machine learning, robotics, all this stuff, I think we're going to see massive change in the next 5 years.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's actually kind of scary when you think everything is moving so fast and then 5 years passes and you look back and you're like, wow, I didn't realize that's been around for this long. Like,
Yep.
I think a good example of that, and you have definitely been around this because it's one of your hobbies with photography, like camera technology now. It just
Oh,
keeps like going higher and higher and higher quality to the point where it like kind of looks fake sometimes. Like, what are your thoughts on that sort of evolution of that technology?
well, I think that technology, like those improvements are great. Like I remember my first digital camera, it was a Kodak and it was like a 1.2 megapixel and it used, a giant flash memory card. And the pictures were awful. And now on our phones, we have these 12, 18, 21 megapixel devices that have gotten smaller and smaller and better and cheaper and cheaper. Um, so I think that's kind of the role of technology is to how do you continue to iterate and become better and have a larger reach. But I think the risk too is, with these technologies now, the phones are coming with these cameras that will change your face and smooth it
Yeah.
out and add these effects. And now with AI and computer generated video and photos, it's like it's going to be very difficult to determine what's real and not. And as long as we don't kind of check ourselves, we may be comparing ourselves to these unrealistic things that can cause problems
Yeah.
in our own minds. So it's just you gotta stay grounded somehow.
Well, it's kind of scary too because we already do that so much in our day-to-day lives. I remember growing up, especially in school, that was something that we would hear about all the time is like the dangers of social media in comparison.
Yeah.
And it's inevitable because we're human that we're going to do it anyways, that we're going to compare it to the people that we think are better than us or whatever. Um, and it's definitely one of those things that's amplified times not even 100 but a million now because of how instant everything is with the internet and social media. What would you say is one of the biggest upsides and downsides to social media? So one of each. What's one way that you could use social media as a great tool? And then what's one of the extreme downsides that honestly makes you worried about where we might be going?
Yeah, I think one of the upsides has to be how easy it is to connect with people that you would otherwise not be able to connect with. So I use it quite a lot to connect with my family. Um, so my mom is older, and it's difficult without technology to stay in touch. So that's definitely an upside. The downside is a lot of people, we believe instantly what we see or read. And so there's no, like, I wish we had a better understanding of like how trustworthy or how expert the information was that was coming to us. Because when we see it printed or we see someone who's an influencer and they say something, we elevate its importance and sometimes we give it more credibility than it should have. So I worry about we're going to take action based on people that we shouldn't be following at times because they seem like they're so influential and knowledgeable.
I agree with you for sure. And so you also run a business on the side where technology is a huge thing that you implement, whether that's taking pictures of products or driving your car to go and look at products or bidding online for auctions on storage lockers. Um, talk a little bit about what may happen and what process you might take if you did not have all of this technology accessible. And would you find that process as fulfilling, or do you think you might not even decide to take the jump into that sort of endeavor that you're doing?
Yeah, so I do buy and resell stuff. I've got an eBay store primarily, Bizarre Resale, and the technology of the marketplace, so either an Amazon or an eBay or a Mercari or Poshmark or whatever, they definitely make it much easier. I don't know that I would be doing this without that. But then the flip side of it too is, yes, it would be much more difficult for me to do what I'm doing and more expensive to do what I'm doing without the technology. But it also means that there are probably fewer people to compete with in that same space.
That's what I
So
was thinking.
there's pros and cons to it. Um, but if your passion is not part of what technology is helping, then sure, you'd be great if the technology were not there. But I've always had this drive to try to figure out how to do something faster, cheaper, more consistent since the beginning. And so technology is critical for that.
Yeah, I mean, that definitely makes sense for sure. And I think the majority of people would agree with that sort of sentiment just because of how we've talked about how integrated it is with everyday life. Something that I think technology and especially computers has gotten a lot more geared towards are things like work and school now. I know neither of us really are huge fans of like college or things like that, but when you have these forms of technology making it so much more accessible, what do you think the justification of keeping prices like so high on these things are, but we claim that they should be more accessible for everybody?
Well, yeah, so on the college thing, college wasn't for me. Um, Learning, it was important. I continue to learn every day, and I just took a different path there. I do find it interesting that there there are a ton of options from high quality institutions for educating yourself online for virtually nothing at all. I've taken classes offered by Stanford, MIT. Um, and I focused on topics that I cared about, and it really didn't cost me anything. And in fact, they were the same classes and lectures that were being given to students that were there at the universities and having to pay for tuition and all that. So I think that the value proposition changes over time, and for education in particular, yeah, the value for me was in the learning, and less about the physical space and networking with folks there. But for other people, it may be very important to what they're trying to achieve. It wasn't there for me.
Yeah, I think that makes sense, and I feel the same way. I honestly I don't really believe that one college is like super necessary just because of like what you were saying. There's so many opportunities and options out there to get education and content for next to nothing, if not nothing, for free.
Yeah.
But also it brings up this question in my head of as someone who has kids and as you were growing up evolving with this sort of thing, how hard was it for you to kind of maneuver and like commit to a route that you were going to establish a standard and what you expected and how you were gonna, I guess limit us healthily to the exposure of all of this technology in the changing environment.
Well, I have to say that like the environment and the community that you grow up in and your kids are in influences things quite a lot. Like whatever is normal for one family may not be normal for a different family living in a different area. And so you kind of conform to the community standard, what people find accessible or acceptable. Um, like I didn't get everything, like there were things that I thought were probably not necessary for the family to have at such a young age, like cell phones. But everyone around us was doing it, and so you have to weigh, should I really make a big deal out of this versus, what's the problem if you go ahead and allow that? So yeah, you have to make compromises. You have to look around you and see what is the community standard, and then you have to know what values are really important to you. So for me, exposing you guys to a lot of different things, music, sports, technology, those things were, I wanted you guys to be exposed so you can make some decisions about them. You can experience them and let that influence you. Um, Mostly my job as a parent was to make sure that you were safe and then guide you to opportunities and let you guys pick your path.
Would you say that that's kind of a similar route that your parents might have approached with you, and that's kind of what allowed you to explore and find so much like information and education with all of the environments that you were in?
Yeah, I never really thought too much about that. As I look back, my parents never forced me to do like any activity, and they didn't limit anything. And so I do remember having the opportunity to try different sports and different activities, playing instruments and things like that. Um, Academics was important and was valued by my parents. I didn't value it quite as much, at least not in achieving the letter grades. I like to learn. I just didn't like the format, but um, yeah.
Yeah, well, that I mean, it really goes to, I guess, speak to the fact that even if you try not to as much, to an extent, you're always gonna kind of bring some characteristics from your influences down. And so for me, I feel very lucky because of the influences I've had, especially since I try to take all the best parts from them.
Sure.
But I feel very fortunate because of even the bad experiences that I was able to get, which I would argue in a tough situation like it sounds like you were in your childhood, you were still able to find the best out of it and win or learn versus just kind of making the worst out of a situation and being upset that you always had to move or you know never really wanting to fully embrace a scenario or an environment because you were unfamiliar with it and it was different. And I think that's definitely something that you pass down to me and the rest of the family as
Yeah,
well, which is super awesome.
that's cool. No, I mean, the thing as a parent that all of us try to do is we try to help our kids have a better life than what we had ourselves. And, I'm pretty lucky. I feel like my parents provided a lot for us and gave us a very good life. And so I was just hoping to be able to provide some of that to you guys as well.
Alrighty, well, we are wrapping up on our time here. It's already been about 40 minutes. It doesn't really feel like it, but I mean, I always love having these conversations with you, and I'm sure this is the first of many episodes we'll do together. You've offered
Yeah.
some great education, and I think one of the big takeaways for this, at least that I've gotten, is that you have to be willing to, like I said, either win or learn rather than win or lose by giving up, and you have to be willing to adapt. And if you can do that, it can take you very far with your curiosity and creativity. But you can also, like you said, contribute in a way that might not be as conventional, and it might not be as popular, but can still be very valuable in the long run.
Yeah, absolutely. That's very well said.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate you taking the time to, come on the show. I've always wanted to, you know this. You've been watching my content. I've always kind of wanted to be in this sort of environment, and you helped set up the studio. Actually, you did all of it pretty much.